Um, Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. And thank you to Dominic and the team for inviting me to chair this next session. So I have a very easy task in the first instance, which is to introduce Professor Shane O'Mara. I know Shane from a lot of work we did together in the early days of the Science Gallery, Shane was one of the early adopters of taking risks and doing things in interesting ways, so I always enjoyed working with him. But to give those of you who don't know him well some background, Shane O'Mara is Professor of Experimental Brain Research and Psychology in Trinity Institute of Neuroscience. He's a former director of the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, where I now work. His research focus and interests are in the neurocognitive mechanisms of group reasoning under real-world constraints. I'm not going to take you through the details of that, but in the context of his talk that's about to come up, I am going to mention that he's also undertaking an extended writing exercise called the Creative Republic Building Societies that experiment, learn and evolve, where he is thinking through ideas for reinventing democracy as a learning, adaptive system, drawing on cognitive neuroscience, social psychology, and sometimes evolutionary biology. So to tell you more, Shane, please come up and join us. Thank you.
So thanks everybody, and thanks to Dominic for the invite. So as Lynn said, I'm doing a kind of a book in public, which I've been publishing in pieces every couple of weeks, and I'm calling it the Cognitive Republic. And the general idea is to think about how we can build societies in a different way, so that we can think about how we can have societies that can learn, that can experiment, and that can evolve. So anyway, I'm not certain how this fits thematically with the week, but Dominic has mentioned a few times the idea of thinking together, and that's become a really important research interest of mine over the last while, is how people reason together when they're put in deliberative groups to think about difficult problems. Okay, so let's just get going. So the challenge really here I have is to try and think in a new way about reviving our democracies. I don't think it's any secret that there's widespread discontent with our democracies. There's lots of loss of trust. There's loads of surveys right across the world showing that there's declining levels of trust in media, in politicians, in political parties, in political institutions, and far beyond that. So I'd like to think about a new way of thinking about how we can revive our democracies in some way. And as Lynn has already said, I'm going to draw on a variety of disciplines to do so. And anyway, well, let's get going. So if we think about democracy in its most general sense, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about this idea that we can reason together, we can think together, we can decide together that we're going to do X, Y, and Z in the future. In other words, we have shared methods for knowing. We have to think about standards for evidence. Do we believe what one party says? Do we disagree with what another party says? Do we have methods for dispute resolution? Well, we do. We have all of these things. You know, you can go to court if you've got a dispute. We can reason together about something if we disagree about it. We can think about norms for how we revise what we think. And of course, a lot of this is predicated on having a stable memory. We need a good record of what has happened in the past, but we also need to be able to think about how we project ourselves into the future. So I think of this as a kind of a shared epistemic infrastructure. We have to know things together, we have to share realities together in some way. But that's been weakening in recent years, and we know this. There's been lots of polarization in our societies for one reason or another, and our shared beliefs about things have been in decline. And we've seen this tested in recent years. If scientists were to be to follow the idea that we just present the evidence, we wouldn't have any anti-vaxxers in the world. But that's not true. We have them. But we have them for reasons that are explicable. It depends who you're talking to, who you believe, where you think sources of legitimacy within your society come from. And of course, there are bad actors who use division in order to gain power and all of those kinds of things. And we have solutions which I don't think are especially good at the moment. One is the strongman solution. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism across all parts of the world in all sorts of ways. And we've also seen the rise of technocracy, the kind of trust us, we know what we're doing because we're the experts. And I think we, the citizens of our various countries, fall somewhere in the middle of all of these, and we find ourselves in a difficult place. And then if we just think back over the last 20 or 25 years, there's been so much going on. The economist Adam Tooze invented the wonderful phrase polycrisis for the kinds of things that's going on in our lives at the moment. And these are just a few that we've experienced. There have been multiple financial shocks. There's one going on at this moment because of the war in the Middle East. We've had numerous pandemics. Some have been contained, some have been worldwide. There's a huge problem, of course, with the climate. We've seen this just here recently in the last months. It felt like the rain was never going to stop. There's housing shortages. We've all sorts of other issues. And state capacity, the ability of the politicians that we put in place to do things seems to be lagging the responses that we need. And as I've said already, trust is declining. And one solution is to pick on an outgroup, say that they're the people to blame for the problems that we've got, rinse and repeat. It doesn't solve the problem, but it gives a place to direct public anger. So there is a legitimacy gap in my mind. We have periodic elections, but the feedback from elections is slow, takes several years for it to bubble through. We see a lot of process, but we don't see delivery. And here's where my particular interest is. We don't see much by way of institutional learning. We don't see much by way of collective learning to power our way out of the problems that we've got. So if we think about the language that we use, the democratic vocabulary we have is one that is appropriate to a different world. It evolved over a 100 or maybe 200-year period from the 1700s through the great liberal thinkers and others in the 1800s up to the present day. But the problems that we used to confront were reasonably clear. The trade-offs could be stated with some precision, not complete precision, but at least some. And the world was slower. It was certainly much more stable than the world we're experiencing at the moment. And what people are experiencing is lots of volatility. There's lots of threat to status, of course. There's drift in institutions, and there's governance failures, all the rest of it. We, again, just walk around the city and we can see evidence of things like enormous financial overruns because people aren't in charge. Nobody's taking responsibility for what's going on. And then, of course, if you look in the Dáil or other deliberative chambers, there's lots of performative outrage. It's hard to believe the politicians are actually as angry as they apparently are over whatever the issue of the particular day is. And then, of course, some polls say we have to go back. We have to go, do something from the 1950s when things were better or whenever their preferred decade was. So what can we do? Sorry, I have to tilt my head a little here. My cue is a little off. I think what we can't do is continue to recycle 20th century arguments. These really are done. The 21st century problems that we're dealing with are of such a scale and cross borders so easily and so quickly and affect so many people that we really need to move on in some way. And the arguments about left and right still go on. Should we focus on redistribution? Should we focus on tradition? Should we focus on the state versus the individual? All of these debates are still in place, but I think what's going on makes a lot of those debates really, really irrelevant. I've already mentioned the pace of change. There's a deep problem with state capability. There's a problem with adaptability. There are problems with attention, how our attention is diverted in various ways, and there are problems with trust, and this all-important issue of how feedback occurs in the system. How do we get feedback in so that we can correct things that have gone wrong? And I think the end result is a familiar one. There's lots of rhetoric, but it has a really poor traction on the problems that we're attempting to deal with. So I'm going to claim that we need a new democratic language. I think we need a new way, or at least an augmented way of doing democracy. And I think we have to acknowledge that the way we're doing things at the moment doesn't work very well. I don't think that's a surprising claim, but I think it's probably a reasonable one. And the idea that I have is this one, a straightforward one, that we need to really rethink liberal democracies as adaptive systems or as learning systems or adaptive governance systems. Now, I'll spell that out in a moment. Now, I'm not saying all the rest of the things that are important for a democracy should go away. They shouldn't. We have to have votes. We have to have elections. We should have political parties. Courts are absolutely vital. We need systems of laws. Human rights are, of course, an absolute foundation. But this isn't enough. We need to do something more. We need to move the argument forward. So I think our failure is cognitive. At least we can talk about failures in processes, we can talk about failures in politics, but really we should step back and think about what that actually means. These are downstream of our failure to collectively cognize about or collectively think about our problems together. It's easy to focus on a policy mistake, but we need to step back from that a bit and think about what happens where the deliberation around those mistakes is concerned, or around policies are concerned, and how can we do things better in the future. And there's lots of weaknesses. I won't go through them all. But democracies, of course, have courts, parliaments, and all of these kinds of things. This is a framework for offering a way of correction, or feedback is maybe a slightly better word to use, in a public kind of way. But I think what we really need to think about is a decontamination of correction in political direction. In other words, moving away from gotcha politics, focusing much more on how we can think about delivery. Now, this means that we should really be thinking about the feedback loops, how a system can learn, and by a system learning, what you really mean is the people who operate the system, how they learn, how they work together, how they talk together, what are the processes that they use to systematize the work that they're doing. And this means that we need mechanisms for correction. When things are going off course, how do you detect that? How do you have a review window to ensure that what the objective that you set out at the beginning is actually there? How do you have a trigger, a stop or start, a policy break, all of these kinds of things? And how do you unwind something so that we don't continue to commit the sunk cost fallacy? We've thrown so much in, we have to keep going, rather than saying, no, we have to stop, we have to do something differently. And I think if in civic terms, we talked about course corrections more, this would do us a lot of good, that it should be a norm that we're willing to change our minds when the facts that we're attempting to deal with change. Now, what does this mean? Well, if we think about learning where individuals are concerned and generalize that a little, this means that we should be thinking about building learning cycles into governance. Now, this isn't a straightforward thing to do, and I don't want to pretend that it is, but at a high level, it means essentially you're engaged in a process very similar to hypothesis testing. You propose something, you test it, you measure, you revise, you scale, or you stop. And this gives you the space for experimentation that is very frequently missing in our public life, where we give people freedom in particular times, particular places, to do things a bit differently and learn the lessons from that, rather than having a uniform rollout of a policy for the country as a whole, which fails for the country as a whole, or succeeds as for the country as a whole. And this means in turn that citizens need a connection to decisions and revisions that just shouldn't be consulted in some way. We need better institutional memory, and we should be able to do this now because we have tools that didn't exist 5 or 10 or 15 years ago to allow us to track what's going on, to learn lessons, to generate playbooks, and in particular to have memories that survive across elections. It often feels like what we've learned in the past is thrown away. And of course, it must survive personnel turnover, because people come and go, but the structures that we put in place tend to be much more sticky, that they stay around for a much longer period of time. And then I think something that we've never really had a huge discussion about, but you see certainly discomfort around this problem, that people's attention is scarce. The average person has only so much bandwidth in their day to think about the larger problems of life in addition to the issues that they have going on in their own individual family, personal, social lives. So we need to be really thinking about attention as a public good, not simply as something that we can throw lots of stuff at and assume that the public will be able to absorb and engage with it. So what does this mean? Well, we need to think, if you look through the great books of political philosophy, if you read a bit of John Mill or John Stuart Mill, or you read some Rawls, or even Marx or any of these others, the thing that's conspicuously missing when they talk about how society should be is thinking about how people think together. They do not ever consider how it is that people reason together, how people come together collectively to deliberate about something. And to my mind, at least as a psychologist and a neuroscientist, we have to start from individuals. We have to start from the point of view that individual bandwidth is limited. People have bounded attention. People can't monitor everything that's going on. So we have to create institutions, or rather, reframe our institutions in ways that makes them much more legible to people from the outside, so that they just don't appear as black boxes, that we can do something deeper with them. Another thing that's completely absent from all of these works, wonderful and all as they are, Rawls is a fantastic thinker and shaped much of welfare policy over the last 50 years, but never considers issues to do with identity. But people do have identities. People value their status. And people are sensitive about their position in the world, and in particular about having to admit they're wrong about something. So it should be possible to create a society where we can update people's beliefs in a safe way, a socially non-humiliating kind of way, where politics reduces I suppose, for want of a better phrase, the humiliation that's associated with learning that you were wrong in what you think. That it should be okay that we revise our beliefs about things without it actually costing us emotionally where our identity is concerned. In other words, treating our thoughts a bit more like hypotheses. And of course, people in groups make mistakes. And again, when you look through the great philosophers of politics, they don't think about motivated reasoning. People sit around in groups together and find reasons why they're right. Nobody ever sits down and thinks about why they might be wrong. So we need to think about how our institutions have what I'm calling pluralistic scrutiny. That is to say, ways of looking at things which test the boundaries of why we might be wrong rather than why we might be right. In other words, to reduce the feeling that we were less wrong about something rather than more correct about things. And I mentioned anti-vaxxers earlier on. One of the things that is very clear from the literature around vaccination and the recent pandemic is that people trust their peer groups. They don't trust a scientist in a white coat and follow what they say. What they do is they look to knowledge that's circulating within their groups and peers and people that they trust, maybe a physician or whoever it happens to be. So we need to really understand that social learning isn't simply present the information and people will accept it. That's not how it works in the real world. People depend on others to understand how they see their world. So we need to, again, to think about our institutions in ways that allow us to understand that the social transmission of information is not a straightforward process, and we shouldn't expect it to be. And I think I've used the phrase civic ergonomics. We shouldn't expect individuals to stand up and be heroes. We should design systems that allow mutually beneficial outcomes to occur. And we can only do that if we start with understanding how individuals reason together in groups. The phrase was used earlier on, which I'm going to steal, that it all comes down to people in a room. Well, that's true. NEFIT was a bunch of people in a virtual room making a decision about vaccination policy. Our anti-smoking policies over the years have come for similar kinds of reasons. Health officials sitting together saying we must stop this behaviour for all sorts of good reasons. So what I'm not offering here is an idea that we should have a technocracy or rule by experts. I think this is not going to work. Instead, what we need is to think about methods. How do we design democracy that it's a learning regime? And that means that we need to encourage in public life standards for evidence, something that we never think about. We need to have a better understanding of trade-offs, opportunity costs. We need to think about measurement. And we also need to think about revision. This slows the pace of political rhetoric because it demands that you have to say, this is what I think, this is why I think it, these are the evidence bases that I bring forward. I think in turn that means the bandwidth that's soaked up by political events for citizens is probably meaningfully reallocated because individuals regain their agency because of the method. They don't need to think about the latest thing. What they need to focus on is how we know about the latest thing. And that's a much more principled way of understanding our social world, our scientific world, our political world than worrying about the latest finding. If we have a good method, well then the details in some senses go away. And this makes it more difficult for political opportunists, for political entrepreneurs of one sort or another, because there's a lot of friction in the system because of the evidence demand that's placed in the system. And the hope, of course, is that if you think about things in this way, that we generate a much more resilient system. I mentioned identities earlier on. I think these have been terribly underestimated. And people do form themselves into factions. They form strong parasocial relations with particular individuals, with particular leaders. And we need to move away from a tribal way of thinking about identities to a contribution focus for identities. And that's, again, maybe a difficult ask, but it means that in public life we need to be thinking much more about how people can play roles in a variety of different ways. I've named just a few of them there: evaluator, steward, watchdog, whatever it happens to be. And as I've mentioned already, humans are status-oriented. We know this very, very clearly. But again, works of political philosophy tend to ignore this. And what we can do is think about status being granted on the basis of competence, which is something that we don't tend to do in political life very much in terms of public service or adherence to a methodology. And then we rebuild belonging in a variety of different ways. Disagreement should happen, but it needs to be safe. We need to give it a method. Within science, we're now seeing the rise of what's called adversarial collaborations, where people agree to the same methodological standards, but start from very different hypotheses to try and explain a phenomenon. And it's a quote-unquote safe space for disagreement. In public life, we don't have these safe spaces, and I think, again, this is a kind of an idea that can make life possibly a little bit better in terms of arriving at better outcomes. Now, I'm not going to say that any of this is easy. The first place we have to start is a new language. So we need new terms in public life. Things like, what's our baseline? What's the denominator? What's the trade-off? What's the likely range that it's going to fall into? All of those kinds of things. What are the unintended outcomes? And then that means policies should be much more treated as hypotheses. Things like, here's what we expect, here's what we measure, here's when we'll revisit to revise and update. And reversals should become normal. They should be associated with a signal of competence, that you're capable of changing your mind when something has gone wrong, not something that is political politically humiliating. And then policy in this way becomes a test rather than a destiny. Oops. Evidence in turn becomes a public good, especially if you publish it along with reasoning, numbers, uncertainties, all of those kinds of things that people are perfectly capable of grasping. They can do it when they're gambling without any problem at all. They can do it when they're investing. There's no reason why they can do it when they're thinking about evidence in the public domain as well. And course correction then becomes something that's centered around competence, not something that's centered around a humiliating setback that results in a resignation. Although that might actually be necessary too, but that's maybe a different day's discussion. So if we started talking like this, well then conversation turns like this would be normal. It would be okay to ask, what would show you're wrong? What's the denominator? What's the timeline? Who bears the cost? What are the stop, go, reverse rules? I keep thinking of the Children's Hospital when I think of these kinds of conversations, given its very long history. What did we learn last time? Well, don't build it in a really tough site. Where is that written down? Who knows? But the point here is to change what politics is, making it harder to focus on charisma, to focus on tribalism, and especially on performative outrage. And we can't expect the average citizen who is busy to become a policy expert in everything. So what the citizen needs to know is that the method by which we arrive at decisions is epistemically secure. So that gives us a politics that moves on, shared standards of reasoning together, shared standards of thinking, shared standards of correction when things go wrong. We make conflicts easier to deal with because we stabilize how claims are tested, contested in public life. And then we can move past the old ways of thinking of left and right and our newest variant of populist tribalism by making competence the key thing that we focus on. So the promise I think this way of thinking gets us to is a democracy that learns in public, that allows adaptation with dignity, and it gets its legitimacy without requiring people to enter into a deep parasocial relationship with any particular politician and requiring faith thereby in what that politician says or does. I should really finish up, so I'm just going to skip past these last couple of slides. I just want to emphasize that I'm not suggesting we have a technocracy. I think that's a fast road to alienation. The key point here is that experts shouldn't be allowed to decide policy. In the end, it has to be citizens that decide, perhaps mediated through the Dáil or whatever it happens to be. But the method is the important thing. And we need to focus on that. There must be publicly inspectable reasoning. Citizens don't require full information necessarily, but they need a learning regime that they can participate in, that's intelligible, that's corrigible, that allows for correction over time. And this means, of course, people will still have political parties, all of the rest of it. Democratic choice has to remain central, but it's disciplined by evidence and revision norms, something that's conspicuously missing from public life. I just offer this thought that freedom, of course, needs to be exercised. What I think of freedom here in this kind of framework is that people have agency, they have the power to choose, revise. They should be able to pursue a life without domination by others, free of domination by others. But the other side of it is this idea that community is really important, and community can protect individual agency by building constraints on arbitrary power, because we can revisit and visit and revise courses of action. We should have reliable public competence. That's a hard thing to achieve, as we know. We should have correction mechanisms when things are going wrong. When you're implementing a policy, you should be measuring it as you go along, and you end up with a situation where mistakes don't become the destiny that you're stuck with. And again, I know I've been hard on political philosophers, and I'm sure if there's any in the room, they'll have a good reason to have a pop at me. But there's a tension when you read political philosophy between ideas around community and ideas of individual freedom, collectivism versus, I suppose, atomistic libertarianism, where we're all together or we're all broken apart. And I think the key thing is that community actually offers the infrastructure of freedom, so long as our rights are real and corrigibility, that is the ability to read and see what's going on, is also present. I won't go through all of this. This is just how you would think about designing institutions, I think, around these ideas. You have a lot of things to add together. We've experimented with some success in this country with deliberative assemblies, for example, which have had a high level of public approbation and indeed some really remarkable outcomes. We don't have ideas around stop-go revise protocols, at least not very explicitly. We don't think very carefully about operational playbooks. We probably should. We do need to think about integrity. Of course, you can have capture in one way or another. Again, something we need to think about. And we need to think about crisis governance. How do you get rid of something that's no longer working? All of those kinds of things. And I think this comes back to an idea which I'm calling the cognitive commons, which is this idea that we should have authenticated public records. We should have standards of provenance for evidence in public life. And there should be evidence available to rebut particular positions or to support them, as the case may be. So method becomes the regime. So I'm going to skip past this slide because it's going to take too long to go through it. But we often talk about constitutional changes, but of course people can ignore constitutions and do, as we've seen in other countries at the moment. But if we think about the word constitutive rather than constitutional, constitutional is going to clearly continue to be important. But if we build in to democracy the idea of a learning practice, not as a ritual, but as something that happens constantly, this becomes part of the way we think about things. It's the establishment of a new norm. It means that citizenship in turn revolves around this idea that we can co-author our outcomes, our future thinking together. And political truthfulness revolves around a new set of norms. These are to do with trade-offs, delivery, visible correction, not certainty in what we're doing, because the future is unknowable. We can't be certain, but people are required, given the norms that we have in public life, to say, yes, I'm certain X will happen. And then when it doesn't, in a year's time, they've moved on, there's nobody accountable, or a gotcha interview happens. But if the norms around these things become part of public life, where we can have revision, then life becomes very, very different. That means our public language has to shift. The language that's deployed needs to move on in a whole variety of ways. Ideally, we end up with a public culture of evidence, ideally intellectual honesty, maybe that's a hard thing, routine correction and revision, commitment to methods. This is how we will find out. This is how we will do things. And a state that learns can engage in mental time travel. It can journey to the past, it can think about the present, and it can envision a collective future together. One which we would hope would deliver with competence, but in the end reduces this kind of fealty to a kind of politics of trust me, I know what I'm doing. We should trust us rather than an individual. And that becomes, I hope, a society that is resilient by learning faster. So I'll just finish here. I think the key point here is that disagreement is essential in the scientific process. It's essential in all sorts of other processes. And democracy is not at fault when people disagree. The real issue is the shared methods that we use for finding out what's true, and how we can use these to fix what's broken in our political lives. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.